Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Brad Berzer here for American Heritage. We're getting into the 1930s. I am recording this on April 19th, but it is for the Monday, April 20th class. Our last full week of class, everybody. Pretty amazing, and we've still got quite a bit to cover. We've got to cover the 1930s, the 1950s, 60s, and 80s, and we'll be done. So a week from today will be our last class, and of course, then you'll have finals. I will get you a study guide as quickly as possible so that you know exactly what I'm looking for on the final. And I hope you know, as per school rules, we will be doing the final at the exact same time that it is scheduled by the college so that we don't overlap with anybody else's final. I don't remember right in front of me exactly what time or day that is, but just so you know, that will be the time and day for each of our sections. So the 10 o'clock section, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, will be at the 10 o'clock time for Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the 11 o'clock section will be at the 11 o'clock time for the Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. So just know that. And of course, we can make exceptions, especially for Maya in Hawaii. And if anybody else needs an exception on that, let me know. But unless I hear from you, I'm going to presume that you will take the exam at the chosen time, or at least the time chosen by the college, set by the college. The other thing I want to bring up before we get into today's lecture is a reminder that you still have a paper due for me as well. And if you remember what I did, I abolished paper number 2, and so what was paper number 3 will now be paper number 2, due at the same time that paper number 3 is due on the syllabus. So that means at the time that I have requested, that's when I would like you to have the second paper for me, meaning now paper 3, due for me. So total this semester, you only have the 2 papers due for me. The one that we had at the first part of the semester, and then this one we have for the second half of the semester. And you are welcome to use any of the prompts that I gave you for either paper number 2 or paper number 3. So there are 4 possibilities of the paper topics there, and please write on one of those 4. And remember that my topics are always starting points, not ending points. So if there are things that you would like to write about on democracy or on radicalism that I don't quite have in that paper topic, you are welcome to do that. Just remember, your only source is the American Heritage Reader. You don't need to go beyond that. There are no extra readings that you need to do beyond the ones that you have within your American Heritage Reader. So if you have questions about that, feel free to email me, but I will make sure that I will send out an email as well, reminding everybody about the final exam as well as the final paper for me. So just remember, rather than having 3 papers due for me this semester, you only have 2 papers due for me total this semester. But we'll still have your final exam, of course, and it'll all work out in the end. So what I'd like to talk about today is Franklin Roosevelt and the economy. So I'd like to start off by looking at what Franklin Roosevelt says on page 718 of your reader, specifically looking here at his idea that he gives in the Commonwealth Club address, where he tells us 2 things that are going to be very important for his presidency. So he is elected 4 times to the American presidency. He is elected in 1932, again in 1936, again in 1940, and again in 1944. He is the only president to have served more than 2 terms in the history of the United States. He was elected for 4 terms, but he ended up serving 3.5 terms. Now, this, whatever we think of Franklin Roosevelt's politics or his policies, this is an extraordinary thing. No executive has had the kind of power that Franklin Roosevelt enjoyed by the mere fact that he has 3.5 terms in office. Remember, George Washington could have easily been elected for a 3rd term, but he said that no man should have more than 8 years to run the country. That was enough. There was no man capable of running the country for more than 8 years. Roosevelt took it upon himself to do so, and the American people went along with it. That, of course, is now prevented by constitutional amendment. No president may serve more than 2 terms following what was once merely a tradition. It is now a constitutional law. But Franklin Roosevelt, in the Commonwealth Club address, lays out exactly what he's going to do with what he calls the New Deal, a variation on Teddy Roosevelt, his cousin's Square Deal. And we see what the New Deal is. He tells us right at the beginning of the Commonwealth Club address on page 17, "I want to speak not of politics, but of government. I want to speak not of parties, but of universal principles. They are not political except in the larger sense in which a great American once expressed a definition of politics, that nothing in all of human life is foreign to the science of politics." Now, we have to really understand what Roosevelt is saying here to understand Roosevelt. Roosevelt is now telling us that there is nothing at all in the world that is not touched by politics and the sphere of politics. So no matter what other sphere you're thinking of, religion, self-help, family, education, business, all of it in some way is now under the political sphere. This, of course, has been the dream of the progressives for a very long time. Now, we have to be careful. In his politics and in his view of the world, Roosevelt has a very strong progressive streak, but he also has an anti-progressive streak. He was the student, if you remember, I mentioned this a few lectures ago, he was the student of Frederick Jackson Turner at Harvard, and he took to heart the idea that the frontier had closed, and therefore the era of endless opportunities and endless expansion and endless goods that were available because of the frontier, he believed that that was all over. And therefore, rather than having this progressive vision that there's this never-ending supply of things in history, he believes that history is essentially over. And therefore, the goal of a government is not merely to control the economic resources that exist, but to manage them, because we will never have new economic resources again. We're at the end. And therefore, history is done, the frontier is closed, and we must very carefully manage the resources that now exist. And Roosevelt does not believe that can be done by our churches. He doesn't believe that can be done by our families or our schools or our local communities or businesses. It can only be done by the political authority. So I want to speak not of politics, but of government. I want to speak not of parties, but universal principles. They are not political except in that larger sense in which a great American once expressed a definition of politics, that nothing in all human life is foreign to the science of politics. I do want to give you, however, a recollection of the long life spent for a large part in public office. That's actually all Roosevelt's ever done in his life. He never had a job outside of politics. He has been, well, he was born into one of the wealthiest families in America. He's never had to work a day in his life. And all of his life has been dedicated then to serving in political office in one way or another. Some of my conclusions and observations have been deeply accentuated in these past few weeks. I've traveled far, from Albany to the Golden Gate. Right? Notice he's tracing the frontier line, from upstate New York all the way to California. I have seen many people and have heard many things, and today, when in a sense my journey has reached the halfway mark, I am glad of the opportunity to discuss with you what it means to me. Sometimes, my friend, particularly in years such as these, the hand of discouragement falls upon us. Right? We're in the middle of a Great Depression. It seems that things are in a rut, fixed, settled, that the world has grown cold, old, and tired, and very much out of joint. This is the mood of depression, of dire and weary depression. But when we look around us in America and everything tells us that we are wrong, America is still new. He says. It is in the process of change and development. It has the great potentialities of youth, and particularly of, this is true, in the Great West, and of the coast, and of California. I would not have you feel that I regard this as in any sense a new community. I have traveled in many parts of the world, but never have I felt the arresting thought of the change and development more than here, where the old mystic East would seem to be near us, where the currents of life and thought of commerce of this whole world meet us. The whole factor alone is sufficient to cause man to stop and think of the deeper meaning of things when it stands in community. But more than that, I appreciate that the membership of this club consists of men who are thinking in terms beyond the immediate present, beyond their immediate task, beyond their own individual interests. I want to invite you, therefore, to consider with me in the large some of the relationships of government and economic life that go deeply into our daily lives, our happiness, our future, and our security. The issue of government has always been whether individual men and women will still serve some system of economics or government, or whether a system of government and economics exists to serve individual men and women. The question has persistently dominated the discussion of government for many generations. On the questions relating to these things, men have differed, and for time immemorial it is probable that honest men will continue to differ. The final word belongs to no man, yet we can still believe in change and in progress. Democracy, as a dear old friend of mine in Indiana, Meredith Nicholson, has called it, is a quest, a never-ending seeking for better things, and in that seeking for these things, the striving for them, there are many roads to follow. So, what road do we follow? And this is where FDR gives us a very interesting stance on the notion of politics and religion. He tells us in the Commonwealth Club address that there always have been two visions in America. There has been the managerial side, which we see in people like Alexander Hamilton. And then there is the outgrowth side, the immediacy, the idea that America is always young that we get from Thomas Jefferson. What Franklin Roosevelt tells us is that we have to mix the kind of unlimited progress of Thomas Jefferson with the managerial skill of Alexander Hamilton. In other words, in order to get Jeffersonian ends of freedom, we must use Hamiltonian means to achieve that. And therefore, rather than having a kind of economic aristocracy, we must reach for an economic democracy. And we can only do this by using the Hamiltonian means of government to achieve the Jeffersonian ends of freedom. And that's what Franklin Roosevelt really represents in his own understanding of America. That America must be this mix between what is Jeffersonian and what is Hamiltonian. This won't be easy, but this is what he is going to do throughout all of his understandings of what he calls the New Deal. And we can break down the New Deal into four parts, because that is what Franklin Roosevelt does in his own understanding of American history. So here we have it. I want to give you the four phases or four developments of the New Deal. So what we might call the first New Deal is actually the Proto-New Deal. And it was under Herbert Hoover from 1929 as president until 1933. What we would call this New Deal, this Proto-New Deal, is what Hoover called corporatism. That is the use of business to try and figure out how business itself can be harnessed by the government so that it can increase wages, it can build roads and canals and dams. In other words, there's going to be an almost complete alliance between business and government. Now, in the old world, in the old world of the 19th century, as well as in the old world of Europe, this would have simply been known as capitalism, the harnessing of capital by the federal government, and that friendship between federal government and business. When we see Franklin Roosevelt come into the presidency in 1933, even though he calls his program a New Deal, it is really not new at all. And so we enter the second phase. If the first phase of the New Deal is the Hoover's presidential policy towards the economy, which we would call corporatism, or in the old word, capitalism, Franklin Roosevelt has no new ideas. He only has a new administration. And so from 1933, when he comes into the presidency, until about 1936, what we find is that this first formal New Deal, not the proto-New Deal now, but this second phase of the New Deal, what we now call the New Deal, because that's what Franklin Roosevelt called it is really just a very simple continuation of what Herbert Hoover had tried to do, but with new people in office. So rather than the Republicans doing it, we have the Democrats doing it. But then when Franklin Roosevelt is reelected in 1936, he changes his tune. And this becomes the third New Deal from really about 1937 until 1939. And this is the most radical form of the New Deal, this third phase of the New Deal, in which Franklin Roosevelt tries not to work with business, but to control business. As he says, he will be the master of the economy. He will be the master of corporations. And he does interfere at every level in terms of prices, in terms of wages, in terms of what businesses can start and what businesses can finish. Franklin Roosevelt has his hand in the economy in every single way. And this is an absolute disaster for the economy. It was a disaster in 1929 when Herbert Hoover tried to mess with the economy. It was a disaster in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt continued those policies of messing with the economy. But it gets even worse in 1937 and 1938 and 39. In fact, the economy does such a nosedive during this time period that economists have no words for it. They simply call it a depression within a depression. And I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. But this is the third phase of the New Deal, an almost complete attempt to run the economy by the government. This is the most, I hesitate to say socialist because it's not quite there, but it really does represent the kind of national socialism that we see of Mussolini and Hitler. It's not the complete socialism of Lenin or of Stalin, but it is very, very similar to the fascists and the National Socialists. Without the anti-Semitism, though Franklin Roosevelt hated Jews, but without that kind of anti-Semitism that we saw in Germany, but a very similar kind of economy. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And then the final phase of the New Deal is the phase that is the longest lasting, and this is 1939 all the way up until 1945, 46, and this is where not only does the country have its entire economy controlled by the presidential office that is out of the executive branch, but it is now in wartime mode. So these are the four phases of the New Deal. The Proto-New Deal under Herbert Hoover from 1929 to 1933, the continuation of that New Deal, but now under Franklin Roosevelt from 1933 to 1936 or 37, the absolute control of the economy by the New Deal between 1936 and 37 to 1939, and then the War New Deal, the fourth New Deal, from 1939 to 1945 and 46. When Truman comes into the presidency in 1945, he pretty much deregulates both the labor market and the corporate market, and we move much closer towards what we had had in the 19th century, towards laissez-faire, not completely by any means, but Truman is no New Dealer, even though he was vice president in the final term of Franklin Roosevelt, and he comes in and really changes things dramatically. But I want you to understand something, several things actually. That is, no matter how much we might criticize Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt, and they're very similar in a lot of ways, They were genuinely trying to help things, though they both made things much, 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 much worse. So the last time that we had an attempt to control or not control the economy, as I mentioned in the last lecture, was through the 1920 recession, the 1921 recession, and it adjusted itself within just a few months because Harding just stepped back and he said, look, that's not the job of government to interfere with the market. And once he stepped back, the economy cleared up very, very quickly. In 1929, however, when it hit in October of 1929, Hoover, not having learned his lesson from Harding 9 years or 8 years earlier, instead intervenes at every level possible. And really what we find is that no president prior to Hoover had ever felt himself completely responsible for the economy going down, and Hoover tried everything to change it, and he only made things much, much worse. So let me give you a couple of statistics here, and then we can talk about what causes the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover said in his own rhetoric that he would wage war on the Depression. He said, the battle to set our economic machine in motion in this emergency takes new forms and requires new tactics. We tried to use emergency powers to win a war. Now we will use the same things to fight this depression. There shall be no retreat, and the attack shall continue as is now organized until this battle is won. Right? So he uses very militaristic language in trying to take on this depression. But he fails, just like Franklin Roosevelt will. They both fail to make things better. And yet we have to understand this is hell in America. Unemployment right before the Great Depression hit in September of 1929 was at roughly 3.2%. So that means that in 1929, before the Depression hits, roughly 96% of all Americans were working. But by 1933, unemployment had risen to 25%. This is unbelievable. And then a year later in 1934, this is now fully under Franklin Roosevelt, with all of those kind of primitive New Deal ideas going into effect, first under Hoover and then under Franklin Roosevelt. Unemployment was very close to 27%. That means that roughly 1 out of every 3 working Americans was unemployed. And that means that they had no access to economic resources at all. One economic historian writes about this. That is, as of about 1934, some 34 million men, women, and children were without any income at all. We're talking about 28% of the population had absolutely no access to jobs, to food, to education, to clothing, to housing. We're talking about an absolutely huge percentage of Americans who were hit by this depression. Some 34 million men, women, and children were without any income at all. This represented about 28% of the United States population. Landlords could not collect any rents and so could not pay taxes. City revenues collapsed, bringing down the relief systems such as they were, and almost all social services collapsed. Chicago, just as one example, owed its public school teachers close to $20 million that it simply could not pay. In other areas of the country, schools just closed down for the whole year in 1933 and 34. In New York in 1932, more than 300,000 children could not be taught because there were absolutely no funds. And among those kids who still were able to go to school, the health department reported that probably 20% suffered from severe malnutrition. Those are the kids who get to go to school, right? And even among those kids who go to school, about 1 out of every 5 was suffering from severe malnutrition. By 1933, the U.S. Office of Education estimated that about 1,500 colleges had gone bankrupt In 1933 alone, about 1,500 colleges had gone bankrupt, and a number of university enrollments fell by close to 250,000. Not a single public library in Chicago could buy a single new book for well over 12 months between 1933 and 1934. I mean, this is just absolutely stunning to think about what happened to the economy. And of course, I am saying these words on April 19th, 2020, and we are living in unprecedented times. Forbes just estimated that between 500 and 1,000 colleges will shut down over the next few months. We have higher unemployment rates than we have had in years right now, and we are entering into a recession. So the great craziness about all of this is, of course, we have chosen to do this to fight the virus as a society, but we are suffering and will suffer huge economic collapse because we have chosen to take down the economy voluntarily because of this virus. Now, I am not in any ways, Brad Berzer, qualified to say, I mean, I have strong opinions about this, but I am not qualified to say if this is right or wrong. But I do want you to realize that as you're listening to this, and I'm guessing that most of you will listen to this tomorrow on April 20th on Monday, yeah, we're in a crazy, crazy situation, and we have not been in this kind of situation since the 1930s. It's been 90 years since we've been in a situation like this. But what I want you to understand historically, right? Please recognize we're in weird times. But what I want you to understand historically is that there was an almost complete collapse in the confidence of the market in the late 1920s and 1929 and into the 1930s because people blamed the Great Depression on the excesses of capitalism. And that's not quite fair. I think that there are three reasons that the Great Depression hit and continued for as long as it did. Number one, there were in the 1920s, there was a huge movement towards raising tariffs very high. And at that point in the world economy simply could not handle those tariffs because we needed America and Great Britain as the great economic engines during the 1920s, but we essentially shut off America through two major tariffs in the 1920s. One in 1922, which was called, oh gosh, you guys, I'm sorry. You know what? I can't remember exactly what that tariff was called. The Ford tariff, if I remember right, in 1920. I'm not even sure who passed 1922, who passed it, but it was one of the highest tariffs we had had up to that point. And then we have an extremely high tariff being passed in 1930 called the Hawley-Smoot tariff. And this meant that many of those countries that were trying to come out of their own recession after World War I were not able, we were still charging them all kinds of debt to pay off their debt. We were still charging them much, but because we had issued this 1922 tariff, I'm sorry, it was the Fordney-McCumber tariff, I remember now. We had the 1922 Fordney-McCumber tariff, and then in 1930, the Hawley-Smoot tariff. We had really closed off a huge part of our economy to those very countries that needed access to our economy to be able to pay things off. We also had, if you remember, in 1913, the creation, and this is the second reason that the Depression hit, we had the creation of the Federal Reserve. Prior to 1913, almost all banking in America was private banking. We really had not had public banks since the collapse of the public banks in the 1830s. So we went generally, with some exceptions, but we generally went from about 1837 up until 1913 with almost completely private banking. And private banking was a success. it's impossible to say it wasn't a success. It was a great success in all kinds of ways. And we were on a silver gold standard, meaning that our money was private. But all of that changed with the creation of the Federal Reserve. And with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, we create this quasi-public private system that really didn't know what it was doing, and it was in charge of issuing currency. So rather than our currency being private, it was being issued by a board of governors. And we now know in hindsight that between 1921 and 1928, the Federal Reserve was inflating the currency by about 61, close to 62%. So we were having hidden inflationary powers, and of course that's going to have to come to an end at some point. And we had not experienced inflation like that since the American Revolution. So with a currency with inflation going at around 61 to 62%, this was drastically changing the economy. So leading up to 1929 and the collapse, we had both the high tariff system and an inflationary monetary policy, and those both created incredible instability in the economy. And therefore, it's not surprising that in 1929 we would have an adjustment. But Hoover, by involving the US government, did not in any way, shape, or form help the economy, but dragged that economy even further into the Depression, so that the US Depression, the Great Depression of 1929, does not end until 1946. So it is a 17-year depression, and that's because the third reason the depression hits is simply because, or continues, is because the United States is constantly interfering, and it just can't quite figure out what it's doing, and every time the government gets more involved, the economy gets worse, so that we get to that point where we get to 1937 and 1938, and what do we find? We find at that point that the United States is not only in a depression, but it is within a depression within a depression. Now, there was a lot of criticism, certainly, of FDR during his time period. There was a lot of criticism of Hoover, and then a lot of criticism of Franklin Roosevelt. H.L. Mencken, one of the most famous commentators of the 1930s, always referred to Franklin Roosevelt as the Führer, or as that quack. And he said of the brain trust, that is, those people around Franklin Roosevelt, that they were an astounding rabble of impudent nobodies, a gang of half-educated pedagogues, non-constitutional lawyers, starry-eyed uplifters, and other sorry wizards. One other critic called Franklin Roosevelt a swollen-headed nitwit with a messiah complex and the brain of a Boy Scout. And the very famous, extremely famous psychologist and psychiatrist at the time, Carl Jung, one of the two most famous, along with Sigmund Freud, said after meeting Roosevelt that he had the most amazing power complex, the Mussolini substance, the stuff of a dictator, absolutely. But the point of this class, of course, is not to criticize Franklin Roosevelt. There were things that I think we could say about him that really, really were quite disturbing. But no matter what his politics were, the worst thing was simply that he was a demagogue. There's no question about that. In the way that he used his speaking ability, he was an excellent speaker, especially on the radio, and the way he presented himself with his fireside chats, and the idea of kind of creating himself as the great father of the country. He truly was living out the life of a political demagogue. And the very fact that he ran for a third term and then for a fourth term is enough to indicate how highly he thought of himself. Remember what Calvin Coolidge had said: any man who believes that he is the only person to run the republic has already committed treason. And no matter what Franklin Roosevelt's policies were, whether he was right-wing or left-wing, whether he was a fascist or a socialist or a Democrat, it doesn't matter. He violated the spirit of the U.S. Constitution by being in office or attempting to be in office for 4 terms. Now, it is true the American people went along with it. There's no question about that. But that does not make it constitutional at all. And his second administration was really the last constitutional administration, at least by habit, that he had. But having said that, and having indicated these 3 reasons for why the Depression was so long and so deep, tariffs, and messing with the monetary supply, and then messing with the economy over time, I want you to know all of those things, but I also want you to remember that no matter what the cause was, the Great Depression was absolutely serious when it comes to what had happened to the American people, what they were suffering, who was able to be fed and who was not. So when Franklin Roosevelt started creating, through the New Deal, all kinds of public works programs and the Works Project Administration, there was a lot of rejoicing in America, because even if these were make-work jobs, and some were and some weren't, even if they were make-work jobs, they were still putting food on the table for Americans, and they were allowing Americans to survive. And without question, and I am certainly no New Dealer, and I'm about as radical as it gets in my own libertarianism, I am not a fan of government involving itself in the economy at any level or in any way, shape, or form. Regardless, all we have to do is drive around a small town, and we'll find that quite often many of the public buildings that exist in the public schools and the bridges that exist were all built by the Works Projects Administration. That is, they were New Deal projects, and they were definitely built with quality, and they were built to last. And I have to respect that. As much as I disagree with how those projects were funded, I also recognize just historically that not only did they allow the American people to survive, but at least when the American people built something, they didn't build a Burger King meant to last for a year or two. They built projects and they built buildings that are standing firm and strong almost 100 years later. So that's great. At least that aspect of it is great. Well, I want to finish today's class because we've been talking, if I've got my gauge right, we've been talking here for just a little under 40 minutes. I want to end by reading to you from what I think is the single greatest artistic work of the New Deal era, a book by one of my favorite authors. This is not his best book, but it is the best book of the Depression, called The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. If you want to read a truly great book, I think a contender for being the great American novel, read East of Eden. And I would highly recommend that all of you read East of Eden now or over the summer, as soon as school is out. But I want to read to you from chapter 5 of The Grapes of Wrath, because I think Steinbeck more than anyone, and Steinbeck's politics are always interesting. He was relatively pro-New Deal, but he was overall somewhat conservative, and he spent the last few years of his life driving around America, giving speeches on the meaning of the republic and what it means to live in a republic. He and his dog Charlie drove all over America, trying to kind of remind Americans what it meant to live in a republic. I respect Steinbeck immensely for that. But before we get to that, in The Grapes of Wrath, he writes this beautiful chapter, chapter 5, in which he tries to describe what is going on with America and how average Americans are thinking about what this depression means. So chapter 5. The owners of the land came onto the land, and more often a spokesman for the owners came. They came in closed cars, and they felt the dry earth with their fingers, and sometimes they drove big earth augers into the ground for soil tests. The tenants, from their sun-beaten dooryards, watched uneasily when the closed cars drove along the fields. And at last the ownermen drove into the dooryards and sat in their cars to talk out of the windows. The tenant men stood beside the cars for a while, and then squatted on their hams and found sticks with which to mark the dust. In the open doors, the women stood looking out, and behind them the children, corn-headed children with white eyes, one bare foot on top of the other bare foot, and the toes working. The women and the children watched their men talking to the owner men. They were silent. Some of the owner men were kind because they hated what they had to do, and some of them were angry because they hated to be cruel, and some of them were cold because they had long ago found that one could not be an owner unless one were cold. And all of them were caught up in something larger than themselves. Some of them hated the mathematics that drove them. Some were afraid, and some worshipped mathematics because it provided a refuge from thought and from feeling. If a bank or a finance company owned the land, the owner man said, the bank or the company needs, wants, insists, must have, as though the bank or the company were a monster with thought and feeling, which had ensnared them. These last would take no responsibility for the banks or the companies because they were men and they were slaves. While the banks were machines and masters all at the same time. Some of the owner men were a little proud to be slaves to such cold and powerful masters. The owner men sat in the cars and explained, "You know the land is poor. You've scrabbled at it long enough, God knows." The squatting tenant men nodded, and they wondered, and they drew figures in the dust, and yes, they knew. God knows. If the dust only wouldn't fly, if the top would only stay on the soil, it would not be so bad. And the ownermen went on leading to their people and leading to the point. You know the land's getting poorer. You know what cotton does to the land. It robs it. It sucks all the blood out of it. The squatters nodded. They knew. God knew. If they could only rotate their crops, they might pump some blood back into the land. Well, it's too late. And the ownermen explained the workings and the thinkings of the monster that was stronger than they were. A man can hold land if he can just eat and pay taxes. He can do that. Yes, he can do that until his crops fail one day, and then he has to borrow money from the bank. But you see, a bank or a company can't do that because those creatures don't breathe air. They don't eat meat. They breathe profits. They eat the interest on money. And if they don't get it, they die the way you die, without air, without meat. It is a sad thing, but it is so. It is just so. The squatting men raised their eyes to understand. Can't we just hang on? Maybe the next year will be a good year. God knows how much cotton next year will grow. And with all the wars, God knows what price cotton will bring. Don't they make explosives out of cotton and uniforms? My gosh, if we could get enough wars going, cotton will hit the ceiling. Maybe next year, maybe. And they looked up questioningly. We can't depend on it. The bank, the monster, has to have profits all the time. It can't wait. It'll die. No, taxes go on. When the monster stops growing, it dies. It can't stay one size. Soft fingers began to tap the sill of the car window, and the hard fingers tightened on the restless drawing sticks. In the doorways and the sun-beaten tenant houses, women sighed and then shifted feet so that the one that had been down was now up on top, and the toes were working. Dogs came sniffing near the owner cars and wetted on all four tires one after another. And chickens lay in the sunny dust and fluffed their feathers to get the cleansing dust down to their skin. In the little sties, the pigs grunted inquiringly over the muddy tenants of the slops. The squatting men looked down again. What do you want us to do? We can't take less share of the crop. We're half-starved now. The kids are hungry all the time. We've got no clothes. They're torn and ragged. If all the neighbors weren't the same, we'd be ashamed to go to the meetin'. And at last the ownermen came to the point. The tenant system won't work anymore. One man on a tractor can pay the place of 12, can take the place of 12 or 14 farm families. Pay him a wage and take all his crop. We have to do it. We don't like to do it, but the monster's sick. Something's happening to the monster. But you'll kill the land with your cotton. We know. but we've got to take cotton quick before the land dies. Then we'll sell the land, and lots of families in the East would like to own some of this land. But the tenant man looked up, alarmed. But what'll happen to us? How are we going to eat? And now the squatting man stood up angrily. Grandpa took up this land, and he had to kill the Indians and drive them away. And Pa was born on this land, and he killed the weeds and the snakes. And then a bad year came, and he had to borrow a little money. And he was born here, and there, in the door, our children were born here, and Pa had to borrow money. The bank owned the land then, but we stayed, and we got a little bit of what we raised. We know that. We know all of that. It's not us. It's the bank. A bank isn't like a man or an owner with 50,000 acres. He isn't like a man either. That's the monster. Sure, cried the tenant men, but it's our land. We measured it. We broke it up. We were born on it. We got killed on it. We died on it. Even if it's no good, it's still ours. That's what makes it ours, being born on it, working it, dying on it. That makes ownership, not a paper with numbers on it. We're sorry. It's not us. It's the monster, and the bank isn't like a man. Well, that was the feeling of the time. How could we ever fight any of this? The depression is bigger than any one of us, and the government and the corporations demand all of this, and the worker gets caught up and spit out and thrown out, and he can't survive. So, no matter what we may think about FDR or Hoover, and no matter how much we might criticize them, it was a hell of a place, and the Depression was a terrible, terrible thing. All right, guys, that ends today's lecture for Monday. No, excuse me. Today, this lecture is for Monday, even though I'm recording it on a Sunday. For Wednesday, I would like you guys to read. I want you to go forward into the 1950s. I would like you to read The Truman Doctrine, The Sources of Soviet Conduct. So The Truman Doctrine by Harry S. Truman, The Sources of Soviet Conduct by George F. Kennan. And I would also like you to read The Problem of Tradition by Russell Kirk. Okay, everyone, until 2 days from now, God bless. Hope you guys are all doing well, and I'll see you in 48 hours.